Fired for refusing the COVID vaccine, then I made one call that collapsed the entire company. The CEO looked me dead in the eye and said, "Get the COVID vaccine by Friday, or don't bother coming back." I laughed, thinking it was a bad joke. But his face stayed cold as stone. The room went silent except for the hum of the air conditioning. Around the conference table, 5 other department heads avoided my gaze like I'd just confessed to murder. And that's when I realized I was in real trouble. "Hi, I'm Evan Price, and I'm 38 years old. What happened to me could happen to anyone who thinks 15 years of loyalty means anything when corporate politics get involved. Before I tell you how one phone call brought down a multi-million-dollar company, go ahead and hit that subscribe button below. If you enjoy real stories where karma isn't just served cold but delivered with devastating precision, this is exactly where you belong. Now let me tell you how losing everything became the best revenge I never planned. It was 2:47 p.m. on a Tuesday when my world exploded. I was sitting in conference room B, reviewing quarterly reports, when CEO Jackson Winters dropped that bomb. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across his weathered face. At 52, he'd built Apex Solutions from a small consulting firm into a $100 million government contracting giant. He thought he owned me. He was about to learn how wrong he was. Walking back to my office felt like a death march. Every step echoed through the hallway as my coworkers pretended not to stare. Word travels fast in corporate America, and everyone could smell the blood in the water. I had exactly 5 days to figure out my next move. My desk looked the same, but everything felt different. 15 years of awards, commendations, and project photos suddenly seemed like museum pieces from someone else's life. The coffee mug that read, "World's Best Project Manager," felt like a cruel joke. But as I sat down and opened my laptop, muscle memory kicked in. My fingers found the encrypted folder I'd been building for 3 years, not for revenge, but for protection. Every suspicious email, every questionable decision, every corner Jackson had ordered me to cut. I'd documented everything because I'd seen too many good employees get thrown under the bus when projects went wrong. In this business, you either had leverage or you had nothing. Jackson thought he was firing a problem. He'd actually just activated a time bomb with a federal security clearance and intimate knowledge of every skeleton in his closet. 3 years of evidence. 84 million reasons why Jackson should have read my medical exemption more carefully. The countdown had begun, and he had no idea what was coming. By Thursday morning, the office atmosphere had shifted from tense to toxic. Whispers followed me down every hallway. The break room emptied when I entered. Even my closest colleagues acted like I was contagious with something worse than any virus. Tracy from accounting, someone I'd personally helped get promoted last year, actually crossed to the other side of the corridor to avoid walking past me. The betrayal stung, but it also crystallized my resolve. That afternoon, everything became clear. I caught a 26-year-old kid touring my workspace with Jackson's son, Tyler Winters. The golden boy was pointing at my dual monitors, nodding appreciatively like he was already planning the redecorating. They didn't even try to hide it. Tyler, fresh out of college with 0 field experience but infinite entitlement. I'd watched him fumble through basic presentations, seen him take credit for other people's work, witnessed him charm his way out of countless mistakes using nothing but DNA and daddy's protection. "This setup will work perfectly," Tyler told his tour guide. "When do I officially start?" My replacement wasn't just ready, he was already measuring the drapes. Jackson was replacing 15 years of expertise with nepotism and hoping nobody would notice the difference. That night, I started planning his education in consequences. Friday morning arrived with the subtlety of a public execution. Conference room B again, but this time with fake sympathy and a termination letter shoved across the table like a restaurant check. "We're sorry it came to this," Jackson lied, though his eyes suggested celebration rather than regret. "Your contributions have been noted." Past tense. Already erasing me from their corporate story. HR Director Patricia Lawson shuffled papers nervously, avoiding eye contact. The whole performance felt rehearsed, like they'd practiced this conversation in Jackson's office mirror. Effective immediately, Patricia read from her script. Non-compliance with mandatory health policies. The security escort through the lobby felt endless. 15 people I'd mentored watched through glass partitions as I packed my personal items into a cardboard box. The walk of shame past colleagues who owed their careers to my training and protection. But in that final moment, muscle memory saved me. My backup hard drive slipped into my laptop bag like a magic trick. 3 years of files, emails, and documentation that painted a very different picture of Apex Solutions than their polished marketing materials suggested. They thought they were firing a problem employee. They'd actually just armed their most dangerous enemy. Sometimes the best weapons hide in plain sight. 2 weeks of radio silence followed my termination. Jackson probably assumed I was sulking at home, desperately sending resumes to competitors who'd already heard about my attitude problem. He was wrong on every count. My home office became mission control for something much more interesting than job hunting. Documents spread across every surface like evidence in a federal investigation. Because that's exactly what they were about to become. The encrypted folder I'd built contained 3 years of systematic violations. Not innocent mistakes or gray area decisions, but deliberate, documented fraud designed to steal millions from taxpayers. Email threads where Jackson explicitly ordered safety shortcuts to boost profit margins. Purchase orders for substandard materials while billing the government for premium specifications. Inspection reports with obvious alterations to hide defects that could kill people. All signed. All time-stamped. All admissible in federal court. Jackson had built his empire on a foundation of lies, and I had architectural blueprints for every criminal corner he'd cut. The $84 million government contract that represented 70% of Apex's revenue was actually a massive fraud operation. My medical exemption wasn't the only thing Jackson had refused to read carefully. He'd also ignored every federal regulation that stood between him and easy money. Time to introduce him to the consequences of willful blindness. The evidence was overwhelming in its scope and damning in its detail. 3 years of systematic deception that showed Jackson hadn't just bent rules, he'd completely ignored federal compliance standards to maximize profits. Internal memos discussing how to fool government inspectors. Email chains where executives joked about taking taxpayers for a ride. Purchase orders proving they'd bought cheap materials and billed for expensive ones, pocketing the difference while putting lives at risk. But the crown jewel was Jackson's personal directive from 18 months ago: forget compliance costs. Our political connections will protect us if anyone asks questions. He'd actually put his criminal philosophy in writing, then signed it with his official company signature. I organized everything into a prosecutor's dream. Chronological order, cross-referenced violations, expert analysis of each regulatory breach. The timeline revealed a pattern of deliberate fraud that couldn't be explained as innocent oversight. My phone sat on the desk, Daniel Peterson's number already dialed but not yet called. My old college roommate now worked for the federal agency that oversaw Apex's contracts. One conversation would trigger an investigation that Jackson couldn't stop, couldn't spin, and couldn't survive. But once I made this call, there would be no going back. Jackson's empire would crumble, taking innocent employees down with his criminal enterprise. My finger hovered over the call button. Justice demanded action, but conscience demanded consideration. Then I remembered Tyler's smirk as he toured my office, and my finger found its target. "Evan, good to hear from you," Daniel said, sounding genuinely pleased. "How's life at Apex Solutions?" "That's why I'm calling. I'm not there anymore." The conversation lasted 37 minutes. I explained everything: the medical exemption, the termination, the systematic fraud I'd documented. Daniel listened without interruption, his breathing the only sound on the line. "These are serious allegations," he said finally, his voice shifting from friendly to official. "If what you're describing is accurate, we're talking about major federal violations." "How major?" "Criminal prosecution major. Prison time major." Papers rustled in the background. "I need to see everything you have. How quickly can you move on this? If the evidence is as comprehensive as you're describing, payments could be frozen within days. Full investigation launched within the week." I thought about Jackson's arrogance, Tyler's entitlement, and 15 years of loyalty rewarded with a security escort. "I'm sending everything tonight." "Evan," Daniel's voice carried a warning. "Once this starts, it can't be stopped. Federal investigations take on lives of their own." "Good," I replied. "Some things shouldn't be stopped." After hanging up, I encrypted the files and prepared the most devastating email Jackson would never see coming. 3 years of evidence, packaged for federal prosecutors who specialized in corporate fraud. The torpedo was loaded. Time to find the target. I spent the evening organizing evidence like a prosecutor building a RICO case. Every document cross-referenced, every violation linked to specific federal statutes, every email chain arranged to show the progression from oversight to deliberate fraud. The timeline was devastating. It showed Jackson hadn't just made mistakes, he developed a systematic approach to stealing from the government while endangering public safety. Email threads proved he knew substandard materials could cause structural failures. Purchase records showed he'd chosen profit over safety repeatedly. Communication logs revealed he'd coached employees to lie to federal inspectors. At 11:43 p.m., I attached the complete evidence package to an encrypted email and hit send. The timestamp would later become Exhibit A in Jackson's criminal trial. Within minutes, Daniel confirmed receipt. "Holy shit, Evan. This is worse than you described." "How much worse?" "This isn't just contract fraud. It's a criminal enterprise. I'm calling the FBI task force tomorrow." FBI. The 3 letters that would haunt Jackson's dreams for the rest of his life. My phone buzzed with another message: "Get some sleep. By tomorrow afternoon, their payments will be frozen and their offices will be under surveillance." I poured myself a drink and watched the city lights twinkle through my window. Somewhere across town, Jackson was probably planning Tyler's first day as senior project director, completely unaware that federal agents were already reviewing evidence of his crimes. Tomorrow would bring a very different kind of morning meeting. The federal machine moved with quiet efficiency. No dramatic raids or news helicopters, just phone calls that froze Apex Solutions' payment pipeline overnight. By Tuesday, the company's cash flow had mysteriously stopped. Government contracts that normally paid like clockwork were suddenly under administrative review. Jackson's calls to political contacts went unanswered or returned with vague promises to look into it. Tommy Blake, my former teammate who'd stayed in touch, provided intelligence from inside the collapsing fortress. "The CFO looks like he's seen a ghost," he reported during a careful phone call. "Emergency meetings all day. Jackson's been locked in his office since morning." The beauty of federal investigations was their invisible power. No charges filed, no warrants served, no public announcements. Just the slow strangulation of cash flow that kept criminal enterprises alive. Then my phone rang. Jackson's name on the caller ID felt like victory calling to announce itself. Evan. Listen, I've been thinking about our conversation last week. His voice had lost its corporate authority, replaced by something that sounded almost like fear. Maybe I was hasty. Maybe there's still a place for you here. I let him talk for exactly 15 minutes, listening to him stumble through apologies and veiled promises of reinstatement. When he finished his desperate pitch, I delivered 4 words that ended his hope. Too late for that. The line went dead. That night, Daniel's text made me smile. They're in deeper than the Mariana Trench. Jackson's desperation evolved from phone calls to house visits. Patricia Lawson appeared at my door Tuesday evening with a severance package worth triple my annual salary. Jackson wants to make things right, she insisted. I let her talk through her prepared speech about misunderstandings and second chances, before closing the door without a word. Thursday brought Tyler himself, looking less golden and more tarnished. My dad sent me to apologize, he mumbled, unable to meet my eyes. Maybe we could work something out. The irony was delicious. The same people who treated me like a diseased outcast were now begging for mercy they'd never shown. But Daniel's investigation had uncovered something even I hadn't known about, a second contract with identical violations. Apex Solutions hadn't just committed fraud once, they'd made it their standard operating procedure. They're shredding documents, Daniel reported during our evening call. Deleting emails, coaching employees to forget conversations. Classic obstruction of justice. How classic. Federal prosecutors love obstruction charges. Much easier to prove than the underlying fraud. His laugh was grim. They're basically confession to guilt. Jackson was digging his own grave deeper with every desperate attempt to cover his tracks. The cover-up was becoming worse than the crime, and karma was taking notes for the sentencing hearing. Within days, 3 senior developers had quietly updated their LinkedIn profiles. The exodus was beginning. The agency's preliminary findings read like a federal prosecutor's wish list. Systematic fraud, document destruction, witness intimidation, and obstruction of justice. Jackson had managed to violate every federal statute except treason. Internal communications discovered during the investigation were even more damning than my evidence. Executives joking about fooling the feds. Managers discussing bonuses tied to successful fraud. Jackson personally authorizing payments to employees who helped hide violations. It wasn't just corporate negligence, it was organized crime with business cards and corner offices. Meanwhile, the employee exodus accelerated. Word had leaked that FBI agents were interviewing staff members, and nobody wanted to be caught lying to federal investigators. The parking lot that used to fill by 7 a.m. was half empty by November. Tyler's promotion to senior project director was looking more like a career-ending appointment with each passing day. The golden boy was learning that daddy's connections couldn't protect him from federal prosecutors. Then the press caught wind of the story. A reporter from the Business Journal called Friday afternoon. "I've heard rumors about federal investigations at Apex Solutions," she said. "Any comment?" I told her nothing. But Daniel's next call changed my strategy. The termination notice goes out Monday. $84 million, gone overnight. Jackson's empire was about to lose 70% of its revenue in a single day. Time to watch the final act of corporate karma play out in real time. Monday morning brought Jackson's worst nightmare in official letterhead. The federal agency terminated Apex Solutions' primary contract effective immediately. No appeals process, no grace period, no political intervention. 70% of their revenue vanished with the stroke of a bureaucratic pen. Jackson's response was predictably stupid. Instead of accepting responsibility or trying to salvage what remained, he decided to make me the villain in his corporate tragedy. "This is all the work of a disgruntled ex-employee," he announced at a hastily arranged press conference. Evan Price was terminated for refusing to follow company health policies, and now he's seeking revenge through false allegations. My phone exploded with angry messages from strangers who'd bought his victim narrative. Social media trolls called me everything from a traitor to a terrorist. Jackson had painted himself as the wronged party in a story where he was actually the criminal. But the public didn't know about the second contract, a $40 million transportation project with identical fraud patterns. Different timeline, same systematic deception. I discovered it while organizing evidence for Daniel. Email chains discussing how to replicate our successful cost-saving strategies on the new project. They weren't just committing fraud, they were franchising it across their entire operation. Time to introduce that evidence to their legal team. With a simple message, "Fix it, or I will." They chose the wrong option. Instead of coming clean about the second contract, Apex Solutions doubled down on stupidity. Their lawyers filed a defamation lawsuit against me, claiming I'd stolen proprietary information and was using it to damage their reputation. The irony was beautiful. They were suing me for exposing their crimes while essentially admitting the evidence was real. Their legal strategy was confessing to fraud while claiming I shouldn't have discovered it. That's when I decided to go public. The Business Journal ran my story on their front page. Local contractor under federal investigation for massive fraud. The reporter had done excellent homework, corroborating my evidence with public records and expert analysis. The headlines were brutal. Apex Solutions, built on criminal foundation. CEO Jackson Winters faces federal prison. $84 million scandal rocks business community. Jackson hired an expensive PR firm to control the damage, but Spin couldn't overcome documented evidence. Their statements about disgruntled employees and baseless accusations looked pathetic against FBI investigation reports. The company's remaining investors fled within days. Stock prices collapsed. Business partners canceled contracts and demanded audits of existing projects. The domino effect was accelerating beyond Jackson's ability to control. Every day brought new problems, new investigations, new evidence of systematic corruption. But the real destruction was just beginning. Because Daniel's next call brought news that would end Jackson's freedom forever, the criminal task force is recommending RICO charges. RICO, the law used to prosecute organized crime. Jackson was about to be charged as the head of a criminal enterprise. 3 board members resigned in a single day, their lawyers advising immediate distance from the growing scandal. The SE weren't minor investors, they were prominent business leaders whose reputations couldn't survive association with federal crime. The exodus sent a clear signal to everyone watching: Apex Solutions was radioactive. Nobody wanted to be connected when the indictment started coming down. Their largest client, a $20 million annual contract, announced they were reviewing their vendor relationships due to integrity concerns. Translation: they were running for the exits before the FBI knocked on their doors too. Meanwhile, I was fielding calls from rival firms who wanted to hire the man who'd exposed the biggest fraud in local business history. My reputation had transformed from disgruntled employee to ethical whistleblower overnight. Pinnacle Consulting made the best offer. Senior project director position, better pay than Jackson had ever provided, complete flexibility on health decisions. But the best part was the location: 15th floor office with direct views of Apex Solutions headquarters. I accepted immediately and requested window seating. Within days of starting my new position, I watched moving trucks arrive at Jackson's building. Employees carried cardboard boxes past a "for lease" sign that had appeared overnight. The empire that had seemed untouchable 6 months ago was dissolving faster than sugar in acid. Jackson's arrogance had destroyed everything he'd spent 20 years building. And I had the best seat in the house to watch karma deliver its final verdict. From my new office, I witnessed the final death throes of Jackson's criminal empire with perfect clarity. Federal agents arrived Tuesday morning with search warrants and evidence boxes, treating Apex Solutions like the crime scene it had always been. Jackson was escorted out in handcuffs, his expensive suit wrinkled from the stress of inevitable defeat. The local news covered his arrest like a major crime story, complete with footage of him covering his face in shame. Government contractor CEO charged with federal fraud dominated the evening headlines. The powerful executive who'd lectured me about company policy was now facing decades in federal prison. Tyler wasn't arrested, but his career was effectively over. No legitimate company would hire someone whose name was permanently linked to such massive fraud. The golden boy who'd replaced me was now unemployable in our industry. The poetic justice was overwhelming. Jackson had fired me to protect his company and son's future. Instead, he'd guaranteed the destruction of both through his own criminal arrogance. But karma wasn't finished with the Winters family yet. During the FBI's investigation, they discovered Tyler's creative expense accounting. Company credit cards used for personal shopping sprees, Vegas trips billed as client development, designer clothes charged as professional wardrobe expenses. $200,000 in fraudulent expenses over 18 months. Tyler had been treating company funds like his personal allowance while Daddy signed off on every charge. The irony was perfect. Jackson had fired me to elevate his son, and his son's greed was now destroying everything Jackson had built. The federal prosecutors weren't satisfied with simple fraud charges. They wanted Jackson for everything: tax evasion, money laundering, racketeering, and conspiracy charges that could put him away for life. My evidence had opened floodgates of investigation that revealed crimes dating back to Apex Solutions' founding. Jackson hadn't just cut corners on recent contracts, he'd built his entire business model on systematic criminal deception. Daniel provided occasional updates on the investigation's progress. They found offshore accounts, he reported during one call. Hidden assets, shell companies, the complete criminal enterprise playbook. The man who'd fired me over a medical exemption was actually running a multimillion-dollar criminal organization. The irony would have been funny if innocent employees hadn't suffered for his crimes. Meanwhile, Pinnacle Consulting was everything Apex had never been. Merit-based promotions, ethical business practices, complete respect for employee rights. I was finally working for leaders who valued integrity over profit margins. The government contracts I now managed were handled with full transparency and total compliance with federal regulations. Amazing how much more profitable honest business could be when you didn't have to hide criminal activity. 6 months after my termination, Jackson was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. Tyler received 4 years for his role in the expense account fraud. The Winters family dynasty had ended with federal prison numbers and orange jumpsuits. The empire built on lies had finally collapsed under the weight of truth. Justice had been served, but the story's final chapter was still being written. During Jackson's sentencing hearing, I sat in the courthouse's back row and listened to the judge deliver a scathing assessment of his crimes. This defendant systematically defrauded the federal government for personal gain, the judge declared. He stole millions of taxpayer dollars, then compounded his crimes by destroying evidence and intimidating witnesses. Jackson stood at the defendant's table looking 20 years older than when he'd fired me. The arrogant executive had been replaced by a broken man facing the consequences of a lifetime of criminal choices. The prosecutor mentioned my role in exposing the fraud, describing me as a courageous whistleblower whose integrity exposed a massive criminal enterprise. The words felt surreal after months of being painted as a disgruntled troublemaker. As I left the courthouse, I reflected on the chain of events that had led to this moment. Jackson's decision to fire me had literally created the catalyst for his own destruction. If he'd simply accepted my medical exemption, I would have continued working quietly, probably never examining the evidence of his crimes closely enough to recognize the patterns. His arrogance had created his own nemesis. The man who'd thought he was untouchable had been brought down by his own hubris and the simple decision to prioritize politics over people. Sometimes karma just needs the right person to make the right phone call at the right time. 1 year later, I'm sitting in my corner office at Pinnacle Consulting, reviewing proposals for a government contract worth $60 million. The work is challenging, the ethics are spotless, and my team respects both my expertise and my personal boundaries. Pinnacle has grown by 40% since I joined, largely by winning contracts that Apex Solutions would have competed for. Our reputation for integrity and compliance has made us the preferred vendor for agencies burned by Jackson's fraud. The industry has essentially blacklisted anyone associated with Apex Solutions. Companies are more careful about compliance now, knowing that federal investigators watch for the kind of shortcuts that destroyed Jackson's empire. I never brag about my role in bringing down Apex Solutions. Most of my new colleagues don't even know the full story of how I ended up at Pinnacle. When someone asks about my previous employer, I simply say that Apex had ethical issues that made continuing impossible. The understatement of the century, delivered with complete composure. Because sometimes the best revenge isn't dramatic or public. Sometimes it's just quiet success while your enemies destroy themselves through their own criminal choices. The building where Apex Solutions used to operate has been converted into medical offices. Nothing remains of Jackson's empire except cautionary tales told in business schools and federal training seminars. But for me, it represents something more profound, proof that truth eventually surfaces, no matter how deep corruption runs. Last month brought an unexpected phone call. Tyler Winters had been released from federal prison after serving 2 years of his 4-year sentence. He wanted to meet, to make things right, somehow. We met at the same cafe where Pinnacle had offered me my new position. Tyler looked different, humbler, older, marked by the experience of losing everything because of his father's crimes and his own greed. I know nothing I say can undo what happened, he began carefully. But prison gave me time to think about the choices I made. He'd learned harsh lessons about entitlement and nepotism. The golden boy who'd replaced me was now working at a small marketing firm, permanently exiled from the government contracting world that had destroyed his family. My father ruined everything, Tyler continued. But I realize now that I was part of the problem. I took things I didn't earn and ignored warning signs I should have addressed. I listened without judgment. Revenge had already run its course. Justice had been served. What remained was just two people trying to understand how pride and greed had created such devastating consequences. I'm glad you escaped that situation, Tyler said finally. And I'm sorry it took my family's destruction to create your opportunity. Sometimes the best outcome of revenge is watching people learn from their mistakes. Tyler had paid a heavy price for his education, but he'd actually learned something valuable. His father, rotting in federal prison, apparently hadn't. The ripple effects of Jackson's downfall continue spreading through our industry 3 years later. Federal agencies have implemented new oversight procedures specifically because of the Apex Solutions case. Compliance audits are more frequent and thorough. Other companies that had used similar shortcuts quietly reformed their practices rather than risk similar investigations. My phone call to Daniel had created industry-wide changes that protected taxpayers and honest contractors alike. Pinnacle Consulting has become the gold standard for ethical government contracting. We've hired several former Apex employees who were victims of Jackson's crimes rather than participants. Good people who deserved better leadership. The parking lot where I used to arrive at 6 a.m. every morning now serves doctors and dentists. Life moved on, as it always does, leaving Jackson's crimes as just another footnote in the long history of corporate corruption. But the real lesson wasn't about corporate karma or poetic justice. It was about the importance of standing up for principles, even when the personal cost seems impossible to bear. Sometimes doing the right thing destroys your enemies more effectively than any revenge plot could achieve. I still drive past that building occasionally, remembering the day Jackson looked me in the eye and delivered an ultimatum that would destroy his own empire. The medical exemption he refused to read. The termination that freed me to expose his crimes. The phone call that brought down a $100 million criminal enterprise with nothing but documented truth. Daniel calls occasionally with updates on similar cases his agency is investigating. The Apex Solutions prosecution has become a template for exposing corporate fraud, a how-to guide for federal investigators dealing with systematic deception. Your evidence package is literally used in training seminars, he told me during our last conversation. It's the gold standard for whistleblower documentation. The irony isn't lost on me. Jackson's decision to fire me had created the perfect case study for bringing down corporate criminals. His arrogance had literally authored his own destruction manual. Meanwhile, Pinnacle continues growing. We've opened offices in 3 additional cities, all focused on ethical government contracting. The demand for honest business practices has created opportunities that Jackson's criminal model never could have achieved. I've been promoted to Vice President of Government Relations, overseeing contracts worth over $300 million annually. The work is challenging, personally fulfilling, and completely legal. The young analysts I mentor now will never face the choice between conscience and career that Jackson forced on me. They'll never have to choose between exposing crimes and protecting innocent colleagues. Because the industry learned from Jackson's mistakes, even if Jackson himself never did. Prison has a way of preserving people in their worst moments. Jackson will emerge in 15 years as the same arrogant criminal who thought political connections made him untouchable. But the world will have moved on without him. The final irony came 6 months ago when Pinnacle was awarded the exact contract that Jackson had defrauded. The federal agency specifically chose us because of our reputation for integrity and compliance, reputation built partly on my role in exposing Apex's crimes. $84 million over 5 years, handled with complete transparency and full federal oversight. The same money Jackson had stolen was now funding legitimate infrastructure improvements managed by honest contractors. The project Jackson had corrupted was being completed properly, on time, and under budget. Amazing what happens when you don't have to hide criminal activity or pay bribes to cover fraud. I often work late in my office, reviewing compliance reports and safety inspections that Jackson would have forged or ignored. The view from my window shows the city lights stretching toward the horizon, each one representing taxpayers whose money is finally being used honestly. The medical exemption that started this whole story sits framed on my wall, not as a trophy, but as a reminder that sometimes standing up for principles creates consequences nobody could predict. Jackson thought he was firing a problem employee. He'd actually unleashed the force that would destroy everything he'd built through 20 years of systematic crime. One phone call. One conversation with an old college friend. One decision to let truth surface instead of staying buried under corporate politics. Sometimes the smallest actions create the biggest changes. Today marks exactly 4 years since Jackson Winters looked me in the eye and told me to get vaccinated or find another job. 4 years since I walked out of Apex Solutions carrying a cardboard box and a backup hard drive that would change everything. The investigation that started with my call to Daniel has grown into the largest government contracting fraud case in our state's history. Federal prosecutors have used the evidence to pursue similar cases nationwide, creating new standards for compliance oversight. Jackson remains in federal prison, his appeals exhausted and his empire completely destroyed. The man who thought political connections made him untouchable learned that federal prosecutors don't respect local influence. Tyler has rebuilt his life quietly, working in marketing and staying far from the government contracting world that destroyed his family. He sends me a card every year on the anniversary of his father's sentencing, not apologizing, just acknowledging. As for me, I'm exactly where I should be. Pinnacle Consulting has made me a partner, recognizing both my technical expertise and my role in establishing our reputation for ethical practices. The company Jackson tried to destroy through arrogance and criminal greed has thrived beyond his worst nightmares. We've created hundreds of jobs, completed dozens of projects, and proven that honest business practices are more profitable than criminal shortcuts. I never planned to bring down $100 million company. I never intended to destroy a family dynasty or send people to prison. All I did was make one phone call that let the truth out. The truth has a way of surfacing, no matter how deep you bury it under corporate politics, criminal conspiracies, or family connections. Jackson learned that lesson in federal court, though it came far too late to save him. My medical exemption, 3 pages Jackson refused to read, sits in a place of honor in my office. Not because it represents victory, but because it reminds me that sometimes the smallest stands for principle create the biggest changes. 15 years of loyalty erased in a week over a piece of paper they dismissed without consideration. But by the time federal agents knocked on Jackson's door with arrest warrants, I had taken everything he thought was permanently his. The industry respects whistleblowers now in ways it never did before. Companies have compliance officers whose only job is preventing the kind of systematic fraud that destroyed Apex Solutions. Young contractors learn about the Winters case in business school, studying how arrogance and greed can destroy decades of work in a matter of months. But the real lesson isn't about revenge or karma or corporate justice. It's about the importance of having courage when principles matter more than paychecks. Jackson thought he could force me to choose between my health and my career. He never considered that I might choose truth instead. And that choice, one phone call to an old friend, changed everything for everyone involved. This morning, I received a letter from Jackson's attorney requesting a meeting. After 4 years in federal prison, he apparently wants to discuss the situation and explore possibilities for resolution. I won't be taking that meeting. Some people never learn that actions have consequences. Some people never understand that integrity isn't negotiable. Some people spend their entire lives believing that connections and corruption are stronger than truth. Jackson was one of those people. Prison hasn't changed him, it's just given him time to plot his next attempt at avoiding responsibility for his choices. But the world moved on without him. The industry evolved beyond his criminal business model. The opportunities he thought belonged to him by right are now earned by people who value honesty over profit margins. I'm sitting in my office this afternoon, reviewing proposals for our largest contract yet, $400 million over 7 years. The work will employ thousands of people, improve critical infrastructure, and be completed with full transparency and federal oversight. Everything Jackson could have achieved if he'd chosen integrity over crime. If you want more stories where truth triumphs over corruption, hit that subscribe button. Because justice isn't always immediate, but it's always inevitable. The only question is whether you'll be the one making the phone call that lets it surface, or the one hoping it stays buried forever. All I did was make one call that let the truth out. One call that revealed what Jackson had been hiding behind his corporate facade. 15 years of loyalty erased in a week, but by sunrise that day when federal agents knocked on his door, I had taken everything he thought was safe. And I never looked back.